It is a few minutes past midnight on the 27th of July, 1942, on a Luftwaffe airfield in the Egyptian desert called Sidi Haneish. A ground crewman is standing beside a row of parked Junkers transport planes, half asleep, listening to the wind move sand across the runway. He does not know that 80 kilometers to the east, 18 open-topped vehicles have been driving through the darkness for hours without headlights, navigating by compass and stars alone. He does not know that in less than 10 minutes, this quiet airfield full of sleeping aircrew and grounded transport planes is going to become one of the most violent 15 minutes of his life. He does not know any of this because the vehicles that are about to destroy his airfield look almost nothing like weapons of war. They look like toys. Small, low, open to the sky, no armor plating, no turret, nothing that a tank commander would recognize as a machine built for combat. And yet, by the time the sun rises over Sidi Haneish, this fleet of stripped-down, machine-gun-bristling jeeps will have done more damage to the Luftwaffe in one night than most conventional bombing raids managed in a week. This is the story of how a small, unarmored American utility vehicle, never designed for combat, became, in the hands of the British Special Air Service, the deadliest fighting vehicle in the North African desert, not because it was the strongest, not because it was the toughest, but because everything about it, from the number of bolts it carried to the way its radiator was modified, was built around a single ruthless idea: speed, firepower, and the willingness to drive straight at the enemy instead of hiding from him. To understand why this tiny vehicle terrified men who commanded panzer divisions, you first have to understand the war it was born into. By late 1941, the war in North Africa had become a war of supply lines stretched to breaking point. Rommel's Afrika Korps was advancing and retreating across hundreds of kilometers of open desert, and every tank, every aircraft, every soldier depended on fuel and ammunition being hauled forward along a handful of coastal roads and a scattering of forward airfields. Cut those lines, and an army that looked unstoppable on paper would simply run out of the ability to fight. The problem for the British was that the desert itself made conventional warfare almost impossible to sustain. This was not the close, hedge-lined terrain of northern Europe. It was a flat, largely featureless expanse where a column of vehicles could be seen from the air for miles, where dust plumes betrayed movement long before an enemy came into rifle range, and where mechanical failure 200 kilometers from the nearest base was as dangerous as an enemy bullet. Large formations of tanks and infantry could seize ground, but they were slow, thirsty for fuel, and painfully visible. Britain's early answer to this problem had already existed for a year: the Long-Range Desert Group, a small reconnaissance unit that used modified trucks to travel enormous distances across the open desert, watching roads, gathering intelligence, and occasionally raiding isolated outposts. The LRDG proved something important: that small, self-sufficient groups could survive and operate deep behind enemy lines in terrain that swallowed conventional armies whole. But reconnaissance was not destruction. What the British didn't yet have was a unit built specifically to hit the enemy's most valuable and most fragile targets: parked aircraft, fuel dumps, and supply columns sitting undefended dozens or hundreds of kilometers behind the front line. That gap was about to be filled by a young officer recovering from a broken back. The man who filled it was not a general. He was a 25-year-old Scots Guards officer named David Stirling, and in the summer of 1941, he was lying in a hospital bed in Alexandria, partially paralyzed after a parachute jump had gone badly wrong. Confined to that bed for weeks, Stirling had time to think about a question that had been bothering him for months. Why was the British Army sending large commando forces, sometimes hundreds of men, to attack targets that could be destroyed just as effectively by a handful of well-trained soldiers who could slip in, plant explosives, and vanish before the alarm was even raised? His idea was almost absurdly simple. Instead of large raiding parties that were easy to spot and slow to extract, send in tiny teams, 4 or 5 men, parachuted or driven deep behind enemy lines to attack airfields directly. Stirling pitched the idea to a skeptical high command, and in July 1941, he was given permission to form a unit that would become known as L Detachment, Special Air Service, the SAS. Its first mission, in November 1941, was very nearly its last. A parachute drop into a desert storm during Operation Squatter went catastrophically wrong. High winds scattered the men across miles of open desert at night. Many were injured on landing, several were captured, and of the roughly 60 men who jumped, only a handful made it back to friendly lines. The SAS's combat debut was, in blunt terms, a disaster. What saved the unit was not stubbornness. It was a change in method. Stirling abandoned the parachute as the primary means of insertion and instead turned to the long-range desert group, whose drivers already knew how to navigate hundreds of kilometers of open desert without getting lost or spotted. The LRDG would carry the SAS to their targets by vehicle, drop them near an airfield, and the raiders would move in on foot under cover of darkness, plant explosive charges on parked aircraft, and slip away before the sun rose. This method worked. It worked well enough that within months, the SAS began asking a more aggressive question. If a handful of men on foot with explosives could destroy a dozen aircraft in a single night, what could the same men do if they didn't have to sneak in on foot at all? If they drove straight onto the airfield, guns blazing, and let sheer volume of fire do, in 5 minutes, what sabotage charges did in an hour? That question is where the Jeep enters the story. The vehicle itself was nothing exotic. It was the Willys MB, the same general-purpose Jeep being mass-produced for the American war effort, small, light, and originally intended for reconnaissance and liaison duties, not for direct combat. On paper, it had no armor, a thin metal body, and nothing resembling a weapons platform. What the SAS did to it over the course of 1942 turned it into something else entirely. The first change was subtraction. Every part of the Jeep that did not contribute directly to survival or firepower was removed. The windscreen came off, both to reduce weight and because a sheet of glass reflecting moonlight was a beacon for enemy spotters. The doors came off. Even the front bumper was sometimes removed. Since every kilogram saved was a kilogram that could instead be filled with fuel, water, or ammunition for a raid that might last days without resupply. The radiator grille was stripped down to a handful of slats, sacrificing some engine cooling efficiency in exchange for airflow that helped the engine survive relentless desert heat, and a water condenser system was fitted to recapture radiator steam, because in a landscape where water was more precious than fuel, losing coolant could be as fatal as losing ammunition. The second change was addition, and this is where the Jeep became a weapon rather than a vehicle. SAS crews mounted Vickers K machine guns, a gas-operated weapon originally designed for RAF aircraft turrets, in pairs, sometimes in banks of 3 or 4 on a single Jeep. This was not the obvious choice. The standard-issue Bren gun and the older water-cooled Vickers medium machine gun were both more common in British service, but neither could match what the Vickers K offered: an extremely high rate of fire, a simple gas-operated mechanism with reduced friction that resisted jamming in fine desert sand, and because it had been designed for aerial combat, a weight and size that made it practical to mount in pairs on a vehicle with almost no spare capacity. Loaded with a mix of ball, tracer, and incendiary ammunition, a Jeep carrying 2 or 3 of these guns could put out a volume of fire that no infantry section and few individual armored vehicles could match in the same span of time. The math here is almost hard to believe. A single SAS Jeep, with all its guns firing, could theoretically put roughly 5,000 rounds a minute into a target. Multiply that by a column of a dozen or more Jeeps driving in formation through a row of parked aircraft, and you understand why airfields that had never been designed to withstand ground assault fell apart within minutes of the SAS arriving. Every other modification followed the same logic. Sand mats and metal channels were carried to free a bogged wheel in seconds rather than the hour it might otherwise take. A sun compass, immune to the magnetic interference of a vehicle's own engine, let drivers hold a precise bearing across featureless terrain where a normal compass would drift. Extra jerry cans of fuel and water were lashed to every available surface, because the entire operating philosophy of these raids depended on being self-sufficient for days at a time, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest friendly base. By July 1942, this transformation was complete enough that the SAS felt confident doing something it had never attempted before, attacking an airfield not by sabotage, but by driving straight onto it. The target Stirling chose was Sidi Haneish, an airfield roughly 380 kilometers west of Cairo, that the Luftwaffe was using as a staging point for transport aircraft supplying Rommel's forces. By this point in the war, more than 70% of Axis supplies crossing the Mediterranean were being sunk before they reached North Africa, which meant every surviving cargo aircraft on that airfield represented supplies Rommel's army desperately needed and could not easily replace. Stirling's plan abandoned stealth entirely. 18 jeeps, organized into 2 columns of 9, would drive 50 miles through open desert at night from a forward hideout at Bir el Qusayr, and instead of creeping onto the airfield to plant explosives, they would drive directly onto the runway in formation, side by side, and simply shoot every parked aircraft they passed. On the night of the 26th of July, under a full moon and clear skies, good enough light to navigate by, but also good enough for the enemy to eventually see them coming, the 2 columns of jeeps closed in. Each vehicle carried 3 or 4 men, British and Free French commandos side by side, and each jeep was armed with up to 4 Vickers K guns. As they crossed onto the airfield perimeter, the columns opened fire simultaneously, driving down the rows of parked Junkers transports and Stuka dive bombers, hosing them with tracer and incendiary rounds at close range, while explosive charges were flung onto aircraft the guns hadn't already set ablaze. The attack lasted roughly 15 minutes. In that time, somewhere between 37 and 40 German aircraft were destroyed or damaged beyond repair, aircraft that had taken months to build, ship, and deploy, gone in a quarter of an hour. The airfield's defenders, caught almost entirely by surprise, scrambled to return fire, but by the time any organized resistance formed, the jeeps were already breaking off, splitting into smaller groups and disappearing back into the darkness of the open desert. The retreat was not without cost. German Stuka aircraft located and strafed several of the withdrawing jeeps the following day, killing 1 French SAS officer, aspirant André Zernheld, and destroying 2 more vehicles. Of the roughly 60 men who took part, the SAS lost only a handful killed or captured, a casualty rate that, set against the scale of destruction they had inflicted, was almost absurdly favorable. Sidi Haneish was not an isolated success. It was the proof of concept for a tactic the SAS would repeat again and again through the rest of 1942, drive in fast, in numbers, guns blazing, and be gone before the enemy could organize a real defense. Airfields across the western desert that had never needed ground defenses suddenly found themselves vulnerable to an enemy that could appear from nowhere, in the middle of the night, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest front line. The material cost the SAS inflicted on the Luftwaffe and the Afrika Korps was staggering for a unit that, at its peak strength during the Desert Campaign, never numbered more than a few hundred men. By November 1942, the SAS had been credited with destroying over 400 aircraft on the ground, more, by some counts, than the entire Royal Air Force had shot down or destroyed in the same theater over the same period. That is a genuinely strange fact to sit with. A unit smaller than a single infantry battalion, using vehicles with no armor and barely a windscreen between them, outperformed an entire air force in the business of destroying enemy planes. But the destroyed aircraft, staggering as the number is, may not have been the SAS jeep's most important contribution to the war. The deeper damage was psychological. Rommel himself is reported to have said that this one unit caused him more harm than any other Allied unit of comparable size. That comment reflects something the raw statistics don't fully capture: the effect of knowing that no re-area airfield, fuel dump, or supply column was truly safe, no matter how far it sat from the front line. Soldiers who had felt secure hundreds of kilometers behind the fighting now had to post guards, dig defensive positions, and sleep uneasily, because a column of jeeps might appear out of the darkness at any moment. This forced the Axis to divert resources it could not spare, men and equipment pulled away from the front line to garrison and defend rear installations against a threat that struck rarely but unpredictably, and that vanished as quickly as it arrived. In a campaign already defined by supply shortages, every soldier and gun tied down guarding an airfield in the rear was one fewer available at the front. There is also a broader legacy here, one that extends well beyond North Africa. The formula the SAS refined in the desert, a small, self-sufficient team mounted in a lightweight, heavily armed vehicle operating far from any conventional support, became a template that special forces units around the world would study and adapt for decades afterward. The specific hardware changed. The Vickers K gun gave way to newer weapons, the Willys Jeep gave way to Land Rovers, and later, purpose-built vehicles like the Supercat and the modern Jackal. But the underlying principles Stirling and his men worked out in 1942 never really changed. Strip the vehicle down to nothing but the essentials. Load it with more firepower than anyone would expect a vehicle its size to carry. Trust speed and surprise over armor. And use it to strike targets the enemy assumed were safe simply because they were far from the fighting. Return to that airfield near Sidi Haneish in the last moments before dawn on the 27th of July, 1942. The ground crewman who had been dozing beside the runway a quarter of an hour earlier is now watching burning wreckage where a line of transport aircraft used to sit. He never got a clear look at what hit him. In the chaos and the trace of fire, all he could really make out were low, fast shapes weaving between the aircraft, guns hammering, gone again into the dark almost as quickly as they'd arrived. He would have had no way of knowing that the vehicles responsible were, underneath all that firepower, nothing more exotic than a stripped-down American utility jeep, the same basic vehicle used for message running and liaison work across half the armies fighting in the war. What made it lethal wasn't the machine itself. It was everything the men of the SAS had chosen to strip away, and everything they had chosen to bolt on in its place. Stirling would be captured the following year, in January 1943, though he would attempt to escape 4 times before finally being sent to the high-security prison camp at Colditz for the remainder of the war. But by then, the method he had built was no longer dependent on him. The jeep-mounted raiding tactic he had pioneered in the desert had already outgrown its inventor, spreading through the SAS as it moved from North Africa into Italy and, eventually, into Northwest Europe following the D-Day landings. It is a strange kind of irony that one of the most feared vehicles of the Second World War carried no armor plating at all. Its protection was never meant to come from steel. It came from not being where the enemy expected it to be, and from carrying, on a frame the size of a small family car, more firepower than most people would think possible. In the end, the deadliest vehicle in the desert wasn't deadly because of what it could withstand. It was deadly because of what it could deliver, and how little warning it gave before delivering it.